Welcome to How the World Works. I'm Kevin Williamson, writer in residence here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and this is a podcast where we talk about work, which sometimes means jobs, sometimes it means other things, stuff that we've done over the course of our lives, how we got there, and what we get out of it other than the paycheck, even though the paycheck is not the least important part of it for most of us. My guest today is Jonathan Farber, someone I've recently got to know. It's been a while. Our paths have sort of almost crossed a number of times, but we finally got together about a couple of months ago, and I was a guest on the Fifth Column podcast. Fifth Column, that would be that's botany or something. Fifth Column podcast, of which Jonathan is the executive producer. So there's a little podcast log rolling going on here, but that's a natural part of the order of things. His main jobs in life are he is a East Coast private equity guy sometimes, and a West Texas oil and gas guy sometimes. I'll let you decide which of those is the Jekyll and which one is the Hyde. And I think they, like Jekyll and Hyde, necessarily go together in complex and in mutually reinforcing sorts of ways. So, Jonathan, welcome to How the World Works.
Thank you, Kevin. It's great to be here.
What do you do all day?
Oh, man. Well, I mean, today wasn't really a very typical day in that sense. There was, very, very significant price action in the oil markets with the sort of developing situation in Iran, the war. So, it wasn't necessarily a typical day. I have spent the better part of the last 30 years running an energy private equity firm called Lime Rock Partners, which I founded in 1998 with one partner. And a few months ago, I started easing back out of that role a bit. I've informed my investors I'm becoming a senior advisor to that business. And I've been basically starting a new media venture. I've always been very interested in the media business. I'm very concerned about the dearth of quality journalism. Frankly, I've been a bit inspired by what you and your colleagues have accomplished at the Dispatch. And I think there's a really vital role for quality, independent, fact-based journalism to play. So I've founded a home for sort of independent journalism, which we call Osprey Studios. And at this point, we are production partners, as you mentioned earlier, with the Fifth Column podcast. And we're also working closely with Longview Investigations, which is a venture started by Andy Mills a few months ago that is doing quality independent journalism as well.
Why did you choose the name Osprey? I think those are very cool birds, by the way. If you've ever seen one hit the water, when they come down like at 300 miles an hour and hit the water to snatch a fish up, it is really an impressive thing to see.
Yeah, it is. And it's really no more complicated than that. My place out in Connecticut is on an island off of the town of Norwalk, and we have several ospreys that live around here, and it's pretty rare to go more than a few minutes without seeing ospreys. Well, at least when they're not down in Mexico for the winter. The ospreys, are quite a sight to see. They're incredibly impressive birds, and I just thought that was. I ended up naming my house out here Osprey Barns, and that's we took that name for the studio as well.
I lived in Norwalk once upon a time too. My house did not have a name. It was the townhouse between the other two townhouses. It was close enough to the train station that I could walk.
Got it.
I actually moved to Norwalk because I'd taken a job at National Review, and I'd been living in the D.C. area before that. And I did not have time to go to New York to look for an apartment before the job started. And I figured Norwalk, Connecticut just sounds like a nice enough place. And how bad could Connecticut possibly be? It was nice. I lived there for a year. It was great. Rode that train a whole lot, and was always perplexed by things like the train would be delayed an hour in the fall because there were leaves on the track. And that, train's been there for like 100 years or something. You figure out their leaves every fall, but I guess they haven't figured out how to deal with that yet. What I wanted to ask you about, kind of first of all, is well, two things. Let's talk a little about the energy industry because it is an interesting time for it right now because there is a war in Iran. As someone once said, wars is God's way of teaching Americans geography. So we're all talking about the Strait of Hormuz now and its importance to shipping both directions. I think sometimes people forget that stuff goes both ways through there. It's not just oil and petroleum products, also a lot of things like food and manufactured goods going both directions. It's an important waterway that the Iranians have some dominance over. And but of course, the oil and gas story in the United States has been a really interesting story for the last 30 years, really, in a lot of ways, maybe a little bit longer than that. I mean, it's been an interesting story for a long, long time, but there's been this especially interesting chapter that you and your investments in your company were a big part of because you got in right around the time that what we call, for lack of a better term, fracking really took off, which means this combination of technologies involving hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling and all the rest of this stuff that has made it possible to extract oil and gas from places that wouldn't have been economical to do that a generation ago. And I was thinking about this week because I had it's rarely a joy to write an obituary for someone, but I really enjoyed writing the obituary for Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb guy who insisted we were running out of resources. And I spent many, many years arguing with people talking about this phenomenon that I like to call peak oil. And in the 90s, it was all, we're running out of oil and gas. And yes, there's a lot of reserves, but we'll never be able to get to them because it's too expensive. And then lo and behold, it wasn't because there's supply and demand curves. And turns out when stuff gets scarce, it's worth putting capital into. So maybe walk us through a little bit about what happened during those years and what your role in it and your company's role in it was.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, and again, I don't know whether we're going to sort of go back and step through this, but I had started my career at Goldman Sachs. I went to Georgetown. I studied international security at Georgetown, and of course, during my senior year, late in my senior year, the Berlin Wall came down. So my focus on Eastern Europe and Soviet studies was immediately obsolete. So I didn't labor under the misimpression that my education was going to be highly applicable to what I was going to be doing for very long, which I think was
had you gone through the trouble of learning Russian?
I had. So
nice.
Yeah.
Great investment.
Yeah. Oh, well. But we can go through there's actually sort of an entertaining story of how I got to work at Goldman. But the bottom line is I spent 8 years at Goldman.
I like entertaining stories. Let's start with that one.
All right, let's do it. So I had, when you go to Georgetown, it's almost a vocational school. It's really, I think it's a little bit less this way now, but it was traditionally, very, very focused on taking the United States Foreign Service exam. So you would take a number of courses that were focused on the exam itself and on the things that you would be doing as a diplomat. I took the exam in my junior year and I was able to pass it. What happens is you get a slot the January after you graduate in the United States Foreign Service. So basically, I graduated from Georgetown. I never really thought about doing anything else because that was what you trained for. And moved back home to my folks' place in Connecticut. I was actually delivering pizzas for Domino's for a period of time after school, and I was getting kind of a consistent drumbeat of input from classmates and people 1 or 2 years older than me at Georgetown about the Foreign Service not really being an ideal place. It was a period of time when the Foreign Service was going through a shrinking phase, which meant that the initial assignment, when you're sort of a consular officer stamping visas and doing things that are not particularly rewarding, had been extended from 2 years to 3 years, and in some cases more. So there was a lot of very negative kind of feeling about that. So I started thinking about other options. I was reading. I read Michael Lewis's book, Liar's Poker, around that time about the story of Salomon Brothers in the late 1990s. This was in 1991. So it sounded. I mean, look, Michael Lewis, I'm sure, doesn't intend Liar's Poker to be a recruiting guide to Wall Street. That's not the intention of the book, but it sounded like kind of a zany environment where if you were, smart and ambitious, maybe you could learn something, maybe you could make some money, and you didn't have much to lose at that point in time. You're 20, 21 years old, coming out of school. So I sent my resume into a few places, and including Goldman Sachs. And Goldman's research department had just lost a financial analyst. There was the oil analyst was sort of a legendary guy who was also very tough to work for. So he had just lost his assistant, and I met with him and got along well with him, and ended up going to work there. And it was actually the month that Iraq ended up invading Kuwait. So we were right in the crosshairs of some real excitement at that point. So I sort of started on a high note at Goldman. It was a pretty wild place to be.
Did you know anything about energy at that point?
I mean, I had taken a course at Georgetown on the geopolitics of energy. I knew Daniel Yergin, who went on to write the prize. It's sort of the seminal work on the role of the petroleum industry in kind of the modern world. His wife, Angela Stent, was actually my advisor at Georgetown. So I knew something about the role of energy, and I was interested in energy overall. I didn't know anything about finance. I had not taken a single finance class at Georgetown. That's not what you do in the School of Foreign Service. People joke that SFS stands for Safe from Science because you don't have to take a science course in the program, but you don't have to take any finance courses either. So everything that I did on the finance side, going to work in the research department at Goldman, was essentially self-taught. I actually feel like that turned out to be a huge advantage, because rather than sort of learning the theory from, dry textbooks, I was sort of immersed in talking to investors and talking to company executives and writing reports and trying to basically provide value-added information to Goldman clients from very early on. So it was really more of a practitioner-oriented suite of knowledge that I developed, as opposed to being something that was theoretical.
Yeah. Do you think at Georgetown today there's many people who are thinking they want to go into the Foreign Service, or you think there are more people who want to go to Goldman Sachs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, look, I mean, I think the one unfortunate way in which the world has evolved since the time that I went to work at Goldman, and we actually had on the fifth column a few weeks ago, we had Lloyd Blankfein, who was kind of my boss's boss's boss at Goldman, and he had a similar story. We took him through the his kind of origin story of how he got into Goldman. He hadn't taken a finance course either. When he went to work there, he went to work in the JR and commodity trading division. And I actually feel like it would be extraordinarily difficult to get an offer at Goldman these days if you don't have the requisite experience. I feel like, people have, there's much more of a focus on credentialism and on, on having the right pedigree, on having the right sort of educational boxes checked. And I think that's part of what's, impacted the sort of meritocratic ethos that used to exist more on Wall Street. I mean, it still does. I don't mean to suggest it's completely gone, but definitely something that's not as present as it was, 30 years ago when I was fortunate enough to get a job there.
He seems like an interesting guy to me, Lloyd Blankfein. I met him one time, and you're expecting, because he's the CEO of Goldman Sachs, at least he was at the time, and this kind of Gordon Gekko, master of the universe type, and he seems like a college professor. He's kind of soft-spoken, cerebral, deferential. He's not a go in and command the room kind of guy, and I suspect that people maybe have expectations about the culture of a firm like that are different from the reality.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was the ethos at Goldman at the time. It was, very much very much based on what you were contributing to the firm. What you were able to, and Goldman's, Goldman was a entirely a partnership oriented organization, meaning that basically nobody made any money until you made it into the partnership in the old days. It's, times have changed a lot since then. But it was all about long-term relationships. That was a key part of the culture. I think a lot of what Lloyd has done is sought ways to maintain the some of the really positive elements of the long-term sort of focus of being a partnership in the now that Goldman has transitioned into being a public company, and I think he's done a relatively good job of that, or he did a good job of that during his time running the company.
I remember the event I met him at was an annual thing for the Business Book of the Year. And normally he's a judge on that panel, but he had to recuse himself that year because when the financial crisis was going on, and he was in all the business books that were nominated that year, and so he didn't want to be a judge of a book in which he was a major subject. So you go into the research department there, and you're researching energy, and it seems like a great place to learn a lot about energy. So pretty quickly, you've got the Goldman Sachs equivalent of a PhD in the finances of energy.
Yeah, it was. I mean, Iraq was at the time was massing its forces on the border of Kuwait, and there was a guy who we worked with in the research department. I won't I won't give you his last name because I don't want to get people in trouble. But I mean, it was a long time ago, but still. But his first name was Ali. So I think with a name like Ali, everyone assumed that he was going to be the expert on these matters. And we would have this thing we did every morning. We'd get on the phone at 7 or 7:30. We'd get on the system-wide call with all the traders and tell them what to expect. And that was a big part of the job in investment research. Is you would get into the office at 6:30 in the morning, figure out which of your companies had news to report, whether there was any industry specific news, and you would convey that to your traders so they could pass that on to their clients, and generate kind of trading and commission flow and other business relating to that. Anyway, we put Ali on the call, and his famous call was that you shouldn't worry about the Iraqi massing on the border. It was all performative, because one Arab country famously would never attack another Arab country. That did not actually turn out to be correct. So that was.
Yeah, some people they get them wrong every now and then. Yeah. Ollie, the oil guy, didn't quite have it. That's too bad. So it's kind of not that your career is over, but there's a sort of bookend going on there. You start off with the Iraq War and the invasion of Kuwait and what became Operation Desert Storm. And now you've just exited a big business, and you are, but still obviously actively engaged in the energy business. And we've got this war in Iran, which is playing havoc with the markets too. Do you look at it and go, yeah, I've kind of been here before. I know how the story goes, or I've got some experience here, or how do the two war markets compare to one another so far?
I mean, there's been a lot of. I would say that this is in a sense significantly worse because we're actually seeing the nightmare scenario take place. The closing of the Strait of Hormuz, right? I mean, this is there's less of because of the advent of fracking, because of the large increase in U.S. oil production. U.S. oil production has gone from 5 million barrels a day at its low to something like 13 to 14 million barrels a day right now. There's been, production increases in other parts of the world. So, Strait of Hormuz, the amount of oil going through the Strait of Hormuz is probably about just pre-war, about 17 million barrels a day. It's down to effectively zero now. And of that 17 million barrels a day, there's probably alternate ways for about 7 million barrels a day to flow. So you're talking about a net loss of 10 million barrels a day. And when you look at the actual production shut-ins that have occurred in the Gulf nations. 10 million
out of a worldwide production of what?
Yeah, out of about 104 million barrels a day. So it's just under 10% of global supply. But in a market that's pretty finely balanced, that's massive. So it is less than what would have been the case, 30 years ago, but it's a pretty bleak scenario, right? So, we've seen coordinated releases from strategic petroleum reserves, which I think are close to 500 million barrels a day, or sorry, 500 million barrels total right now. We've also seen sanctions relief on Russian oil and on Iranian oil in terms of the oil that's currently on the water. In other words, floating storage of another, call it couple 100 million barrels a day. So that's enough oil to make up for, maybe 6 weeks of the production shortfall. So, really what this boils down to, in a sense, is how long is the war going to go on? How long is the closure going to remain in effect? And that's what, traders are trying to determine. I think there's been any number of geopolitical events over the last 3 decades which have threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. It hasn't happened. And I think a sense of complacency has kind of crept into the market as a result of that. The energy conference we were at a couple of weeks ago, we were asked to address the question of whether the price action in the market was fully discounting the risk to oil pricing, and I think we correctly said it probably wasn't. Oil prices have gone up materially from there. They're down quite a bit today because of the comments from the president that he's close to an agreement, or there have been some constructive talks with the Iranians, which of course the Iranians deny. So it's sort of a fascinating situation, but it's a pretty fraught situation, frankly. There's in addition to the oil that flows through the Strait of Hormuz, there's a significant amount of the world's natural gas, up to a quarter of the liquefied natural gas that supplies the international market. It's an incredibly important part of energy production, primarily in Asia, but also in Europe. And it's not going to be easy for the world to make that up. U.S. LNG production is already running in excess of nameplate capacity on the facilities that we currently have on stream. We do have some additional gas production coming on stream, but these liquefied natural gas plants take many years to build. They're incredibly massive engineering projects, and it's not going to be quick or easy to fix those issues.
And maybe people don't want to spend that time and effort and money to build one for a situation that may be resolved in a few months and prices go back down to some other level that makes those facilities less economical than they would be at the current levels.
I mean, look, the Qataris have already declared force majeure on volumes that are as long as 3 or 4 years out, right? So when you're talking about building new facilities, you do have consumers that are willing to sign long-term contracts. So they're not, so people who are looking to make those investments aren't really running the risk of a quick downturn in pricing. But it's just, these are just very long-term projects. That's the issue.
Yeah,
it's not. There's no quick solutions here.
So you're working at Goldman Sachs. This is your first real job out of college, and a lot of people look at a job like that and think that's not a job that I quit. If you're not in that world, working at Goldman Sachs is like that's the finance version of playing for the Yankees, right? That's the job you want. How do you make the decision to transition out of there, start your own thing? What did Goldman think about it? Are they one of those firms that are happy to see people who learn a lot of stuff with them go out and start their own thing, or do they feel a little like, hey, you came and learned all this stuff and now you're taking it somewhere else where we don't benefit from it? And what was your thinking about moving beyond that firm and starting your own firm?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, my position at Goldman was in investment research. I started as a financial analyst, which is very much the low man on the totem pole, but it was an incredible place to learn the industry. Investment research does get a bit repetitive over time, though. You're basically publishing research on an industry. There's a very steep learning curve in terms of coming up in terms of becoming knowledgeable about the industry, understanding the drivers, understanding what investors care about. And it's an amazing place to be. It was better in the old days than it is now. I think there are certain restrictions now legally on the amount of contact that you can have with corporate officers and information flow that makes it a little bit less interesting. But at the time, you were sort of at the nexus of capital formation. You stand between portfolio managers that control, billions and billions of dollars. You stand, you're talking to the corporate, officers who are making decisions, and basically it gives you a unique perspective and understanding how capital formation occurs and what people are looking at, and it was an awesome experience from that perspective. But after you've been doing it for a few years and you're writing your 17th consecutive quarterly update on Burlington Resources, it becomes a bit more boring. And if you have a relatively short attention span, which is definitely a characteristic of mine, perhaps you start looking for other challenges. So initially in 1995, I was working with a wealthy family as a client of Goldman that wanted to build an energy portfolio, and they proposed that I come over and work with them and help them build a robust energy portfolio. And I did that for a few months. Did not work out, but it did give me a great sense of how the investment side of the business worked.
Why didn't it work out?
There was a bit of a political issue. The family had a profile within the environmental movement. So a lot of the deals that I was serving up were deals that they felt like they could take flack on from a public relations perspective, which I didn't fully understand at the beginning. So we just sort of went our separate ways after 9 months, and I went back to Goldman. I ended up calling that my Goldman Sachs sabbatical. And when I went back to Goldman, I joined the investment banking group. I thought, being an investment banker might be fun. And turned out I was a very bad investment banker.
What do investment bankers do?
I mean, they're basically designed to. I mean, they're basically meant to generate transaction flow and transaction fees. So it's Goldman, on the investment banking side, had a much more long-term orientation towards client relationships than most other banks. But at the end of the day, you were looking to manage a bond offering for your client. You're looking to do an M&A advisory. You were looking to do they were essentially short-term transactional type relationships, and very reliant on kind of marketing and on talking to a lot of people, and much less focused on sort of deep knowledge and understanding, which is what I had focused on in investment research. So it didn't turn out to be all that interesting to me. I was, at the time, the U.S. industry was going through a phase where the major oil and gas companies were starting to let go of what they called non-core assets where they just didn't see much of a future and much of an ability to create a substantial amount of value that was meaningful to them at the time. And yet, these were assets that had consistently been undermanaged. Maybe it's an oil field in Mississippi that's producing 3,000 or 4,000 barrels of oil a day, owned by Exxon, as an example. Even if Exxon is able to cut costs dramatically and increase production by 50%, it's just not something that's going to be meaningful to their overall corporate effort. However, if you can get in there and make the contacts within Exxon and convince them that they should take the opportunity to sell the asset and find a petroleum engineer and a good team to take over the asset, you could do very well in a private equity context. And that's exactly what I thought the opportunity was. I as a research analyst in the early 1990s, I covered because there was already an established research analyst. I sort of had to create my own franchise out of these small, scrappy, up-and-coming businesses, which included the Canadian oil and gas producers, which tended to be a lot smaller than the U.S. companies. As an investment banker, I continued focusing on some of these smaller businesses, which were not really interesting targets from a client perspective for Goldman, but they were really interesting to me. So I really started thinking hard about trying to put myself in a role where I could provide investment capital to the most exciting companies that were in that mode. There were two businesses at the time that focused on providing private equity and venture capital to the energy industry. I talked to both of those businesses. Neither of them were interested in hiring me, so I had to come up with my own route. So I was friends with the oil service analyst at Goldman, a guy named John Reynolds, and the two of us spent a few months cooking up a plan to raise capital. It was aggressive at the time. We were both 28 and 29 years old, respectively. So it was a lot to ask for people to entrust capital to us to do this. But we did have the Goldman Sachs pedigree, which is obviously a huge advantage. And we ultimately left in 1998 and started Lime Rock Partners. Yeah. And we were able to raise. Sorry.
I wonder what your level of confidence was like there. So you'd worked at Goldman. You got tired of your job because you were kind of bored with it. You went to try to work for it was a family office, I assume. And
yeah, that's right.
Didn't really work out well. Went back to Goldman as an investment banker. Didn't really love that.
Nope.
So life's going okay, but your work life isn't exactly doing what you want it to do. And then you break off and start your own thing. Were you did you lose a lot of sleep on some of these nights, thinking, "What the hell am I doing? Am I actually capable of doing this? Are we going to lose all these people's money? Am I making a mistake?" What did it feel like?
Yeah, look, I didn't have any kids. I was 28 years old. It was sort of like don't have much to lose at that point. I had spent a total of 8 years at Goldman. So even if the private equity thing hadn't have worked out, when you've got that kind of pedigree, you've got the ability to go back and become an analyst at a hedge fund, maybe running their energy portfolio. There were other fallback options. But I mean, about a year after we left Goldman went public. And we had both been told that we were partner track at Goldman. We were both, me and my partner, we were both vice presidents. And we missed out on a very, very significant payday that would have multiplied my net worth at the time by an order of magnitude. So that was I wouldn't say I try not to live my life with a lot of regret. I make the best decision at the time and let the chips fall where they may, and ultimately it worked out extremely well for us. But there were certainly a few years at the beginning where it looked like maybe our decision process wasn't that great.
Understood. So you had this famous investment in West Texas. People think of private equity. They often think, I think maybe not entirely accurately, people with a really short-term investment horizon. But you were involved in this business for a long, long time, which you recently exited. We tell people sort of the potted history story of this.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the companies that I covered as a research analyst at Goldman was a company called Parker and Parsley Petroleum, which basically bought. There was a field in West Texas called the Sprayberry Field, which had been producing for 50 plus years. When you kind of see these iconic horsehead pump jack wells slowly going up and down and producing oil from many hundreds or thousands of low rate wells, that's kind of a classic image of the Sprayberry. There was a lot of oil in place, but very, very tight rock. So, so the reservoirs gave the oil up very, very slowly. And it turned out that, so I met the officers at Parker and Parsley. I covered it as a company. And after I left Goldman, one of the officers had left Parker and Parsley and started his own business. We ended up backing him in 2007 to acquire some partnerships from GE. GE Capital owned a lot of existing production in West Texas through their GE Capital group. They would not allow the companies to drill much. It was kind of a low risk acquisition. They would allow the companies to do a little bit of plumbing to sort of optimize production, but they didn't really want to be in the business of drilling wells. So we were able to come in and basically take a little bit more risk with our capital, drill some additional development wells. That was kind of the original idea. We provided a guy named Tim Dunn with about $100 million of capital commitment. It was one of our larger investments at the time. We thought it had a very positive risk profile because there was a lot of existing production. So you weren't really taking substantial exploration risk. And then within a couple of years of getting involved, we started to sense that this new technology that was getting a lot of play might be applicable to a substantial part of the asset that we were drilling. And we started to see other companies in the area drill horizontal wells, test some horizontal fracking techniques, and the results started to get interesting. They were not great at first. Horizontal drilling and fracking has a very extensive learning curve associated with it. There's a lot of individual variables. There's hundreds of variables in terms of the sand quality, the particular configuration of the wells, the zone, the landing zone that you want to use, the pipe strategy that you want to use. There's just a ton of things that you have to get right to maximize the amount of production that you're getting out. In the industry, these are reservoirs that were massively complicated to model, so people couldn't really figure this out theoretically. You had to sort of go in there, spend the money, and just try a lot of things. We had an advantage in the sense that we were able to acquire we were able to lease up a substantial amount of acreage. The company that we had partnered with had excellent relationships in the area. We had vertical wells, and when you have a vertical well producing from certain formations, you hold acreage all around it. So we had a large acreage position that we were holding via production, and we were able to kind of sit back and watch others initially waste a lot of money and then start drilling, more economic wells. We called it our last mover advantage, in contrast to what was happening kind of in the tech world. But it worked, and we were, probably the last major landowner in that basin to drill a horizontal well. I think it was maybe 2013 when we drilled our first horizontal well, we were also, that also gave us a big advantage because a lot of the original production from horizontals was not optimally spaced. In other words, the horizontal wells were drilled too far apart and didn't maximize the sweep efficiency from given reservoir area. And then if you go back in and drill wells and downspace the wells, you wouldn't necessarily have the right geometry to optimize production either. So you'd get this what people took to calling an orphan well issue, and you'd end up missing out on a substantial amount of the resources. So our last mover advantage really worked out because we were able to learn from what other people had done and really go in there with the right strategy from the beginning.
Yeah, people who follow Texas politics will know the name Tim Dunn.
Absolutely, they will. Yes.
Yeah. So to summarize, you acquire a whole bunch of land. It's got vertical wells on it, which operate enough to keep you from losing money while you're figuring out everything else. You watch everyone else make mistakes. You try to learn from it, and then you start to get into it when you think you've got it a little bit better figured out. And as it turns out, pretty good strategy.
Yeah, I mean, look, a key part of it was we had, we developed a lot of confidence that the acreage that we owned was ultimately going to be capable of producing a lot more production than it was at the time. And we were extremely proactive in keeping our investors informed. When people invest in a private equity fund, when you invest in a 2007 private equity fund, you expect to start getting your money back in earnest in 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years down the road. And if you're not out of it in 10 years, then, typically something's wrong. And investors are going to start asking some very hard questions. But we were able to expose our investors to a lot of information about what we were doing. We could establish that, the horizontal wells we're drilling were getting better and better. We were opening up new zones to exploitation. The raw economics of drilling were phenomenal. many of our competitors were selling their positions in the basin at the time, and we just made the decision that, given the risk profile, which we felt was quite low because you knew the oil was there, the vertical well penetrations gave you what's called subsurface well control, meaning that you understood how big the tank was, you understood where the oil was, and the only question was, could you, would the engineering work to extract a significant amount of that oil? And because of what others were doing, and the direction of the technology and advancements that were coming in, we were able to get very comfortable that was the case. And we were able to convince our investors of that as well. So we always had a very, people often ask us, we held the position, as you implied, Kevin, for about 17 years, which is very unusual in the private equity business. People often ask us, was that a real struggle? And it really wasn't. I mean, our investors, our investor base, was very endowment focused, people who were like really sophisticated and knowledgeable about the nature of long-term returns. And we were able to make the case persuasively all the way through our holding period that there was more value in holding the position than in selling it.
Yeah. What I know about the nature of long-term returns is that people like them to be higher, and they like that number in front of the X to be a big number. And yours was?
We ultimately made 79 times our investment on the deal. Yeah. So it was unusual. It's not something that is likely replicable in many other cases in the business. It was a reflection of the fact that we were able to acquire during some downturns, both in the sort of 2009, 2010 timeframe, and then when fracking originally started paying off big time, it put the industry, it sort of sowed the seeds of its own demise, because it put the industry into a period of overly abundant supply in the 2014, 2015 timeframe, and started effectively a price war between West Texas and the Middle East, the Saudi Arabian in particular, and that created a low price environment, and we were able to understand that was a temporary phenomena, and we were able to really load up on land during some pretty fortuitous points in time.
An interesting learning curve for you.
Definitely.
You're looking at the Foreign Service, you're doing Domino's Pizza, and then a few years later, you're learning a lot about sand.
Yes.
And sand probably wasn't real big on your intellectual horizon when you were in college.
I will tell you one story. So when I was working at Domino's, and I sent out a bunch of resumes to investment banks after reading Lewis's book. I got the interview at Goldman. I went in and I met with the oil analyst, and he liked me. They offered me the job, so I went into Domino's to quit. And my manager looked at me and said, "I'm sorry to be losing you. I'm not going to ask you where you're going, but I just hope it's not to Pizza Hut." Because Pizza Hut had just opened a competing franchise across town, and he was very worried that I would actually be going over to Pizza Hut, but that was not the case.
People sometimes, I remember in a particular presidential election, it might have been 92, where the term McJobs was thrown around a lot, and people would sort of sneer at fast food jobs. I worked at Burger King when I was a youngster. And one of the interesting things about jobs like that is that these companies actually have a really hard time finding good long-term employees. And when they find the ones that they like, they pay them reasonably well and treat them pretty well. My first piece I ever wrote for National Review actually was a piece on Labor Day about how I'd never actually made minimum wage, in spite of working as a furniture mover, working at Burger King, working at 7-Eleven, places like that. Had never actually, it wasn't a lot more than minimum wage, but I'd never actually made minimum wage. And I'm going to knock on wood here and hope that remains the case, but one never knows in journalism and such how these things will go. What kind of jobs did you do when you were growing up, when you were in high school, summer jobs, things like that? What was your family like?
Um, my dad was a computer salesman for IBM. So he had a good job, but we were solidly middle class growing up, and
And you grew up in Connecticut?
I grew up in New Jersey and then Connecticut, and had a variety of jobs, and including I was a dishwasher at the Westport Ocean House, which was probably the hardest job I've ever had. That was
Why was it so
standing.
hard?
I mean, it's just it's just standing there and washing these giant trays of seafood in this big industrial washer. Coming home smelling of fish and ammonia. I remember very quickly I had one or two outfits that I would wear to work because you could never get the smell out of those outfits. So I would put those in a garbage bag when I got home, and then I would put them on the next time I had to go to work. But it paid really well. I was being paid under the table because you couldn't in a community like Westport, Connecticut. It's hard to find a dishwasher
Sure.
for the Westport Ocean House. So. But
My
I mean,
older
look,
brother
those
had a
are
similar job where he cleaned out the pit at a barbecue place in Lubbock, Texas, called Bigham's Barbecue. But the difference was he smelled great when he came home because he smelled like barbecue.
I
And
mean, okay.
barbecue travels better, I think, than seafood
fish.
probably does
Yeah.
in terms of odors.
That's probably right.
So you
yes.
worked in restaurants. Did you work in other restaurants?
I did that. I worked at an answering service. This is back in the day before you knew, before we had cell phones, and obviously, and you knew who was calling you. So, we had these old time answering services where, businesses would sign up and they would get their phones answered when they weren't there. I ended up, one summer working the night shift. So I had, I would show up at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and I would work until 7 o'clock the next morning, and just answering phones, and do some day shifts as well. And
What kind of company
there
were
was
you
some.
answering phones for in the middle of the night?
Well, it was mostly doctors,
Okay.
and plumbing companies and other companies that needed to have a way for you to reach service people if needed. So you were playing, a bit of a filtering role as well, in terms of what you were doing. It was it was an interesting job. Definitely learned a lot. There was I remember one incident where I was working on like a Wednesday afternoon, and the phone rang for a psychiatrist that was a client, and a woman was calling in to say that she was thinking about killing herself. So I'm like 17 years old at this point. I'm like, okay, all right, I got to get a hold of the doctor. So I grabbed the little notebook with all the information on where he's going to be. Of course, he's playing golf on Wednesday afternoons over at Longshore Country Club. So I call over to the country club, and the pro shop picks up. I'm like, I've got to get a hold of Dr. Smith or whatever. And I'm like, it's an absolute emergency. I need to get a hold of them. They send someone out onto the course. I'm on the phone. 10 minutes later, a very out of breath Dr. Smith comes on the phone. I'm like, doctor, Lisa Jones just called, and she said she's thinking about killing herself. So there's a pause, and then he goes, she's always thinking about killing herself.
Naturally, yeah.
So
Again,
I got,
yeah.
I was supposed to know that, apparently at the,
I imagine
at
those
the age of
overnight shifts
17.
were interesting. I worked overnight shifts at 7-Eleven,
Yeah.
but I don't imagine anyone's calling their plumber or their psychiatrist at 3 a.m. because they're having a good day.
Yeah, there was some interesting. There was a courier company, and this is one of those realizations that you have kind of several years after the fact, because I was always recording where someone wanted to drop off a package or pick up a package, and it was odd. It didn't make sense to me at the time, and it was like, okay, I'm going to have a package at 2:30 this afternoon at Third and Elm, and I would have to write that down, and then periodically the courier boss would call in, and I would read off all the rendezvous that needed to occur later that day. And I mean, I have a pretty good idea what kind of business that was.
So you're in the drug business. Nice.
Apparently, I was. I believe the statute of limitations on that is probably passed. Fortunately,
probably passed. Well, and you were an
unwitting, and I was unaware. I was blissfully unaware.
Yes. Yeah. What's the worst job you ever had? Was that it?
Oh man, there was one summer I took a relatively high paying job, cash job, working for one of these event venues about an hour north of me in Connecticut, where people would take their corporate, their company on a retreat, and they had one of the activities was the egg toss. And sometimes in the egg toss, you break the egg. Turns out, Kevin. So one of my jobs was, and this would always occur, of course, at night. So you had to take a flashlight and just go over the area where the egg toss was occurring, and just dig all the eggshells and all the egg remnants out of the ground. I remember that job. It was a very good paying job, but that was a tough one.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yikes. What's the best job you had? Current one? Is that what you're going to say? Or was there something you did otherwise that you really liked that maybe it didn't pay as much, maybe it wasn't as lucrative, but that you really enjoyed?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm really excited about what I'm working on in the media space now. It's the people that I'm working with are just brilliant and funny, and I think the work that we're doing is important. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, but then again, in terms of my private equity job is sort of uniquely suited to my personality, in the sense that I get to do many different things on a given day. Right? I look at different deals. I think about the deals that people are bringing in, and ways that they're approaching the business in different ways. I interact with our investors and convey what's happening in the business and what's happening in the portfolio. So I don't know. That's not a good answer to your question. I would say, I don't know. I did, when I was in college, I worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia one semester, and we worked on a domestic terrorism case where we found a storage locker. I learned from the FBI people that I worked with that storage units, commercial storage units, typically contain either explosives, guns, or human body parts. There's rarely anything else in commercial storage space, as it turns out, in these these storage units. And we found a bunch of explosives and took them out to an FBI facility outside of DC, and we're able to, and we basically blew them up, because that's what you do with expired explosives. You have to dispose of them by exploding them. So that was fun.
The investigators in the next office over were investigating this courier company that they thought was smuggling drugs around in somewhere.
Probably right. Yes.
Probably right. So you do a lot of other things in life besides business. Also, I know that you're on the board of Georgetown. Is that correct?
I'm on the board of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Yes.
Full service. And you do some other philanthropic things as well?
Yeah, I'm on the board of the Reason Foundation. As well, I'm just joined the board of a new group that is seeking to ensure that AI, that artificial intelligence, is developed with with a respect for the individual, and is not overly focused on kind of centralization. There's a tendency among both two of the major sort of AI factions, thought factions, the doomers and the accelerationists, as we say, to sort of champion this idea that that AI necessarily involves the centralization of decision making, and that there's this idea that the centrally planned economies of the world haven't worked out because of an information problem. And once we solve that information problem with AI, then we can again create, we can start creating utopia on Earth again. This is sort of an undercurrent. They use different language, but that's an undercurrent that runs through a lot of the AI discourse. It's incredibly dangerous because attempts to create utopia on Earth, as you well know, have not been terribly successful and have led to some of the worst human outcomes of any human project. So, I think
and it's not the first time we're trying this. I don't know if you know this, but you probably do. The Soviets made enormous investments in information technology in the late 60s and through the mid 70s, thinking the very same thing, that they would eventually just be able to develop computer systems that would solve, the Hayek Mises, information problem about markets and prices and the lack of those in the socialist economy, and didn't work out. Then, of course, it's one of those lessons that we keep refusing to learn, because the dream of central planning, of course, is so alluring to a certain kind of person who, well, in some ways, I've used Barack Obama as an example of this from time to time. I understand the desire to be a central planner in a way, because if you look at a guy like him, he thinks to himself, my life has turned out pretty well. And it has turned out pretty well. If other people made decisions more like the ones I had, their lives would turn out like mine, which was pretty good. And it's natural, I think, to fall into that line of thinking. So I'm going to ask you now to fall into that line of thinking. And if you have someone who's, 15, 16 years old, smart, enterprising, wants to have a kind of career that looks like a version of what you've done so far, what do you tell him?
That is a tough one, man.
Because I assume that you can't really do what you did. Because as you said, some of these things have become so credential driven, so professionalized, and the silos are so narrow. I don't think I could do what I did, because my lack of a college degree probably would have kept me out of my first job. Someone would have checked if it was now, whereas they didn't check, back then.
Look, I think, I think that when you look at what's happening from an AI perspective, the effect on entry level positions is most devastating. I'm inherently skeptical of claims like that. But as I've looked into it more, and as I've become more involved with Cosmos, this group I was telling you about earlier, I do think there's relevance there. So I do think there's validity to those claims. So, I guess I would go back to advice that I was given early in my career at Goldman. The guy that I went to work for, was a legendary energy analyst, guy named Don Texter, who had a work ethic that was impossible to match. So he was definitely inspirational in that sense. He would tell me the secret in being successful. The secret to being successful is to be a big fish in a small pond, right? Is to find a niche, to find something where you could be the expert. You could be the sort of go-to person. And I feel like that's good advice. The artificial intelligence engines, the LLMs, are becoming increasingly good at tying things together, at performing certain types of work. But I think that specialists that develop expertise and contacts in specific areas are going to remain valuable in that world. So I guess that's what I would. There's always a choice that people have between pursuing sort of a generalist career or narrowing or something that's a bit more narrow. And I just think that maybe on balance, what's happening in the world would lead one to focus more on creating a real value added niche type of expertise.
Yeah. So, it's interesting to me that you're going into a journalistic pursuit at this point, because in a way you started your career as a journalist. We call them financial analysts, but what they do is they're essentially journalists with a very, very specialized beat and a very small readership.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I was actually listening to the Steyerwalt episode that you did, and where he was talking about his early days in journalism, and there's a lot of similarities between investment research and journalism. And the other parallel that I thought was kind of fascinating was, he talked about the driving motivation being the respect of your peers. And that very much was the case for me at Goldman. I mean, once you landed that job and you were, sort of dropped into that environment with a lot of other smart people, it just became incredibly important to produce work and to sort of do things that would earn the respect of your peers. That was, as I think about my early career, that was very much the driving motivation behind that. And I think that's generally understated as a motivating factor for people. Frankly, I maybe this is getting a little bit esoteric. Maybe you'll want to cut this out of the podcast. But I studied a lot of military history at Georgetown. In fact, one year I was going to go spend the summer at Sandhurst, the British kind of West Point. I ended up getting diverted and going to work at NATO instead. It was during sort of the Perestroika era, and I got an offer there to work on some of those issues. A summer after I spent in Poland during the Solidarity kind of revolution, so it was an incredible opportunity. But one of the professors at Sandhurst is a guy named John Kagan, who wrote a number of books. The Face of Battle, The Mask of Command, some of the best military history books ever. And he talks extensively about that as the driving force of, men in combat is the respect of your peers. Like, it's not it's not necessarily love of country. I mean, that's obviously important. There's other motivating factors as well. But when you talk about what drives men in combat to perform, it's the earning the respect of your peers. And I think that was clearly true in the high pressure, Goldman environment I was in early in my career.
I think that's probably true for every occupation. Whatever you're doing, there's the guy who's really good at that thing, who's been doing it for a long time. And it's always sort of a special role that person plays. I think that's one of the underrated important aspects. Particularly, I know I always sound like a bit of a crank sexist when I talk about this stuff, but I think particularly for young men.
Here we go.
Well, I think that particularly for young men, that sort of peer recognition plays a social and psychological role in their lives. It's more important in some ways than it is for young women. Mm-hmm. I think it's just part of how men define themselves. And I think there's just something just sort of inescapable, natural. And I'm not saying it's the same in every case and blah, 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 blah. You have the usual exceptions and caveats and all that. But I think it was true when I was working in fast food. It's true when I was working in journalism. It was true when I worked in nonprofits. I think that people who really, truly excel at something are irrespective of their economic compensation. There are rewards that go along with that. And maybe that is a good place to end it, except for the one question I always like to ask people like you especially is, you going to work till you die, or are you going to go read Russian novels somewhere on a beach or a mountaintop?
Whew, man. I mean, look,
I got 2-year-old kids. I'm work till I die.
Yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, I find, the stuff that I'm doing on the media side right now is just so incredibly satisfying. It's like we've got fascinating people coming into the studio every week. We've got reporting stuff going on. I'm starting to produce a couple of documentaries as well, and I'm just getting such a charge out of it. I just can't. I'm working hard to prevent it from becoming like a regular full-time job, which it kind of has become now. But I'm like staffing up to.
What are your documentaries about?
Well, the one we're working on right now is a classic sports rivalry story, and I'm working on a documentary about a a guy who's sort of quietly been a real champion of freedom of speech over the years, which is a kind of a personal story, but one that I think has broader implications given the threats to free speech that we're seeing from both sides of the political spectrum right now. And I guess that's just a long way of saying that I kind of want to put myself out of a job by filling in the team, but that's so that I can create the sort of maneuvering room for me to kind of float around and dip in and get involved in projects that are most interesting to me. And I don't see wanting to end that. Like that's something that I think is going to keep me interested and focused for along with my advisory role at Lime Rock. I think for the duration. I don't know why I would ever want to stop doing that, frankly.
Jonathan Farber, a man who has discovered many ways to monetize a short attention span. Thanks for being our guest this month. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kevin. That's a great summary, actually. I appreciate it.
That concludes our most recent episode of How the World Works. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jonathan Farber as much as I did. If you would like to watch this on YouTube, there will be a link to that in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in. We still say tuning in, even though no one's actually tuned in to anything in 30 years now. And we'll talk to you next month.